Shavua Tov, everyone. B'ezrat Hashem, tonight we're going to review the last two dafim that we learned, Daf Bet and Daf Gimel. We're going to have 6 sections in today's review, and it goes as follows. The first section we'll deal with is the different scenarios or different cases that are judged by each level of the courts. The second part that we'll deal with today is the sources for these numbers of 71 and 23. Third section we'll deal with is the explanation of the first line in the Mishnah, how Dinim Amunot B'Shlosha, Gzeilot V'Chavalot B'Shlosha is meant to be understood, with a few different explanations. Fourth section we'll deal with is the next line in the Mishnah, which is Nezek and Chatzi Nezek. Fifth section we'll deal with today is the sources that 3 is the number for monetary court cases, number of people. And the sixth and final section of the day in our review will be a machloket if it's actually 3 or 5, which will be Rebbe and the Tanakama, and we'll get to a understanding of that at the end of the day, Be'ezrat Hashem. So let's start the beginning of the Masechta, Daf Bet Amud Aleph, and we're going to cover today Daf Bet and Daf Gimel, Be'ezrat Hashem. Let's get started with the first section at the Mishnah, which deals with 3 levels of courts and their different cases that they judge. Says the Mishnah, the cases of monetary cases are judged with 3 judges. Theft and bodily damage are judged with 3. Nezek, v'chatzi nezek, when it comes to full payment and half payment. Tashlumei kefel v'tashlumei arba'a v'chamisha, double payment or 4 or 5 times. Bishlosha is adjudicated by a group of 3. Ha'ones, someone who rapes a woman, v'amefate, or he seduces a woman. There's a certain penalty associated with those. V'amotzi shemra, or someone that casts allegations against his wife saying she's not a betula, a virgin. Bishlosha de Reb Meir. Reb Meir says you need 3 people to adjudicate these cases. The Chachamim say, motzi shemra be'esrim u'shlosha. You need 23, because if she is guilty, she'd be chayav mita, and that's a capital case. Thus, you need a 23-person court. Continues the Mishnah, makot b'shlosha, to adjudicate a case that may administer makot, lashes in court, requires the court of 3. Mishum Rabbi Yishmael Amr, in the name of Rabbi Yishmael it was said, be'esrim b'shlosha, you need a court of 23. Ibur hachodesh b'shlosha, ibur hashana b'shlosha, to decide if a month is 30 or 29 days, or to intercalate the year by adding an extra adar, you need a court of 3. Divrei Meir, these words are Meir, b'shlosha matchilin, that you start the court case with a court of 3, then they would discuss it with a group of 5, and then they would finish it off with a group of 7. We'll see exactly what this is saying in the Gemara. Nonetheless, if you finished off with 3, it is considered intercalated, it's effective. Continues the Mishnah. Now when it came to these 2 things, you needed members of the Sanhedrin Agadol, or Gdolah, which is leaning on the animal, called Parel and Davar Shel Tzibur, which was necessary if the Sanhedrin paskin something wrong. Most of the Tzibur were involved in it, so they needed to do smicha, leaning on the animal that was brought as a korban before it was brought, as well as Arifat Egla, which was decapitating the calf that would be brought to atone for a body that was found between 3 cities. So the people who would measure it between 2 cities, the people who would measure it would be members of the Sanhedrin. Bishlosha divrei Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says it needed to be 3 members of the Sanhedrin. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'chamisha, you needed 5, not 3. Continues the Mishnah, chalitza, the process known as chalitza, which is when a man decides not to do yibum, marrying his deceased brother's wife, sends her away, v'hamiyunim, as well as a mi'un, which is the process of a girl deciding she doesn't want to be married to the man that her mother or brother married her off. Bishlosha, again, need a court of 3. Neter revayu ma'aser sheni she'en damav yedu'in. If you have neter revai, which is the 4th year of fruits, as well as ma'aser sheni, which are to be put onto money, and then the money is to be brought to Yerushalayim, but if they're somewhat rotting, meaning they're somewhat diminished in their value and it's not clear what their value is, bishlosha, so you need a court of 3 to determine its value. Hakteshot bishlosha, the redemption of hektish, meaning to deconsecrate something that has been sanctified, requires a court of 3. Ha'erachina mitaltalin bishlosha, movable erachin, we'll see in the Gemara what that is, requires a court of 3 to determine its deconsecration value. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, echad man kohen, one of them has to be a kohen, says Rabbi Yehuda. HaKarkaot tish'a v'kohen. Now when it comes to redeeming holy land that was dedicated to Hektish, you need 9 people, as well as a kohen as a 10th man. Ve'adam ki yotze behen, and similarly, when it comes to deconsecrating a person, we'll have to figure out exactly how he was holy. It needs to be similar, 9 people plus a kohen to determine its value, to assess its value. Moving on now in the Mishnah to the next part of this section, which is the capital cases. Capital cases are judged with a court of 23. If an animal was roveya, meaning it had relations with a woman, or a man had relations with an animal, so you need a court of 23 to adjudicate that case to determine not only the person, if he's chayav mita, but also the animal. Like it says, we see we compare the two. The isha and the animal both need a 23-person court. And also it says, by a man having relations with an animal, the animal shall be killed. Also compared to the man, it needs to be a court of 23. Continues the Mishnah. If an ox killed a person, it's liable to be stoned, and it needs a court of 23 to adjudicate that case. The pasuk says, it says the ox is stoned and the owners are killed. So it writes this comparison so as to say, just as the death of the owners would only be if there's a court of 23, so too the ox needs a court of 23 to adjudicate. The Mishnah continues, says not only with an ox, but whether it's a wolf, a lion, or a bear. V'hanamer. A namer is a leopard. V'habardalis. Nabardalis is a polecat or a skunk. Other Mefarshim say different animals, but they're wild animals of some sort. V'anachash, or a snake. Their death would be administered and adjudicated by a court of 23. Anyone that initiates the killing these wild animals is zachai, is merited. See what he's saying in the Gemara. Their death is with a court of 23, and we'll see how he's arguing in the first shita as well in the Gemara. Moving on now to the highest level of courts. We cannot adjudicate, we cannot judge a shevet. Rashi learns it means if the majority of the shevet worshipped avodah zarah b'meizid, we can't adjudicate that case. Or navia sheker, somebody that espouses prophecies in the name of Hashem, but he's false. Or if a Kohen Gadol did something that's liable to capital punishment. You can't judge any of these unless you have the Sanhedrin of 71. You can't go out to a voluntary war, which Rashi learns means anything besides for the wars of Yeshua conquering the land of Israel, unless if you're instructed by the court of 71. You cannot add on to the city of Yerushalayim or onto the courtyards of the Beit HaMikdash unless the 71-person court decided this is the right thing. Courts, lower courts of 23 cannot be appointed for the Shvatim, for the other tribes, unless it was commanded by the word of the 71-person Sanhedrin. They cannot decide that something is an Ir Nidachat, which is a city that the majority of the inhabitants worshipped avodah zarah, needs to be destroyed, unless it is on the word of the 71-person Sanhedrin. Now, once we introduce Ir Nidachat, the Mishnah introduces other halachot relating to it. We cannot make an Ir Nidachat on a border of Eretz Yisrael. Velo shalosh, nor can we have 3 cities that are to be destroyed because they're Ir Nidachat. But we could make 1 or 2 into Ir Nidachat and destroy them. Okay. Now, the Mishnah continues and tells us the sources now, in the second section, that you have a court of 23 and a court of 71. It says the Mishnah, Sanhedrin Gdolah, the great Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim, it was 71 people. The Ketana shel 23, and the smaller one, but still capital punishment courts, was of 23 people. Asks the Gemara, how do we know that the big court was 71? As the pasuk says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu commands Moshe Rabbeinu to gather 70 elders and assist him in adjudicating the people. As for Shivim Ish Miziknei Yisrael, gather me 70 people from the elders of Israel. And Moshe al-Gabe, and Moshe was together on top of them, so that's a total of 71. Rabbi Yehuda said it was 70, you don't include Moshe, and therefore the large Sanhedrin was actually a total of 70, not 71. How do we know that the smaller capital courts were 23 people? The pasuk tells us regarding these appointments of these courts, it says that the court, the Eidah, the congregation, shall incriminate, shall convict, and it also says the Eidah, the Kahal, the group, the community shall make innocent, shall acquit. Eidah shofetet ve'eidah matzelet. Harekan esrim. So there has to be 10 people who can incriminate and 10 people who could acquit. Eidah, as we're about to show, is 10. So therefore, Arikan Esrim, you have a total of 20 already. How do we know that Eidah is a language of 10? As we find by the Meraglim, it says that Matai Le'edah Ra'azot, it says HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe that after the sin of the Meraglim, until when will these people act wrongly? Tatsu Yoshua v'Kalev, as opposed to excluding Yoshua Kalev, because they were two Meraglim that were righteous. So therefore you see, 12 minus 2 is 10. Therefore the word Eidah is used by the Meraglim also connotes 10 people. In the context here, that means there's at least 20. To add another 3. Because the Gemara says the fact that the Pasuk tells us that one should not follow the majority to do wrong, to convict. That when it comes to acquitting, making innocent, you could follow majority. If so, why does the Pasuk have to say you follow the majority for good? It's already implied by the first verse we just quoted. So the Gemara says, so what the Pasuk is telling you is that the capacity to balance in one direction for good is not like that of bad. Which means, when it comes to tilting the side of favor, of acquitting, so there you only need a majority of 1. But when it comes to convicting, incriminating, you'll need 2. So therefore, the Gemara is saying is on top of the 10 that the 10 convictors and the 10 making innocent, you need another 2, so that there could be a majority of 2 on one side, plus the 10 that are acquitting and the 10 that are making guilty, and that would tilt you in the side of negativity. Turn to bet and would bet. But we know you can't have an even court, which we'll see the sources later. Which is this source, because if it would be equal, then you wouldn't have the capacity by making innocent to have one person majority. So it has to be that you have an odd number in the Beit Din. So we add one more, so now you have a total of 23. Finishes the Mishnah. Sanhedrin. How many people have to be in a city that it qualifies to have a 23-person court appointed? 120. Rabbi Nechemia argues and says, Matayim u'shlosha, you need 230, Keneged Sarei Sarot, corresponding to officers or the judges appointed over 10 people. In order to have each judge responsible for at least 10 people, there would have to be 230 people, thus you can have a Sanhedrin of 23. Moving on to the third section, let's start the Gemara now. Now the Gemara starts off with the first section of our Mishnah. Etu gzeilot v'chavalot lav dinei mamonot ninu. Are gzeilot and chavalot, theft and bodily injury, not included in the introduction of dinei mamonot? Why does it say it as a separate category, as a separate clause? So the Gemara is going to give 3 answers. The first is Rabbi Avo. Rabbi Avo. Mahen katani. The Mishnah is to be interpreted as mahen, meaning the second clause is illustrating the first clause. Mahen dinei mamonot. What are the examples of dinei mamonot that are included in our Mishnah? Gezelot v'chavalot. It refers to cases of theft and bodily injury. But the exclusion that the Mishnah is teaching us, when it comes to admitting or loans, it wouldn't have the same halacha as gzelot and chavalot. So Rashi explains these are both cases of being chayiv payment because of a loan. That is excluded from our Mishnah, it's not included. Says the Gemara, but we need both parts of this introduction to our Mishnah, because it have only taught the rules, the cases of monetary. I would have said, so maybe it also includes cases of loans. So Tana gzelot v'chavalot, therefore it teaches the second clause, gzelot v'chavalot, so as to imply that it's excluding loans are different. Tana gzelot v'chavalot, it only taught the cases, the second clause of theft and bodily injury, and it didn't teach dinei mamonot. I would have said, I'd say, really included in our Mishnah is also loans. The only reason it uses this language of gzelot v'chavalot, because the idea, as we'll learn later tonight, of 3 judges in monetary cases is actually derived from theft and bodily injury. How do we know that? Like we find by thievery, which is actually in the parasha of Shomrim, when a person who had deposited an item to be watched claims that the shomer stole it, the pasuk says, and we're going to see later it says Elohim 3 times. That teaches us that the judges have to be 3 when it comes to monetary cases. And chavalot, mali chaval begufo, mali chaval b'mamono. And also the same thing with bodily injury. It's the same as monetary. monetary damage. So therefore, both of these is where the source appears that you need three people. So you may have thought that if it only taught the second clause, that really it includes also cases of loans in the Mishnah. They're the same as Gzelot and Chavalot. Why does it only write Gzelot and Chavalot? Because that's the source for three in the Torah. Tanamahen Dinei Monot. Therefore, the Mishnah says, what is the case of Dinei Monot that are being included? The first clause. The second clause, Gzelot v'Chavalot, only includes theft and bodily injury, but not when it comes to admitting about loans. Beautiful. Now the Gemara wonders, what practical difference is there indeed, according to Rabbi Yavo, between theft and bodily injury versus loans? Ulamai, what's the distinction? If it means you don't need three when it comes to loans, we know Rabbi Yavo says clearly himself, if two people adjudicate a case of mamonot, a monetary case, everybody would agree, this is not going to be an effective outcome. It's not a clear real psak. So you see clearly, in all monetary cases, including loans, two is not sufficient. You need three. Ella, the Gemara says, the distinction Rabbi Yavo says between loans and bodily and monetary damage is you don't need mumchin, which Rashi learns is people that have smicha back to Moshe Rabbeinu, appointed by the Nasi. You could have hedyotot, ordinary judges, not these the professional judges with smicha. Asks the Gemara, if that's true, my kasavar, what does Rabbi Yavo hold, the Tana of our Mishnah holds? If he holds that the parasha of Shomrim and the parasha of Halva'av, loans, are actually combined, so libayi nami mumchin. You should need mumchin, because just as you need mumchin when it comes to Shomrim, because Elohim means mumchin, professional judges, so the same thing should be true when it comes to loans. And if he holds that they're not mixed together, so then you don't have the source for Elohim three times when it comes to loans, and you shouldn't need three for loans. So the Olam Kasavar, the Gemara answers, really, Rabbi Yavo would hold, the Tana of our Mishnah holds, Eru Parshiyot Katuv Kan, that the Parshiyot are meant to be mixed together, and therefore you should need three, and you also should need Mumchin when it comes to loans. You should really need Mumchin. The reason you don't, Yishum de Rabbi Chanina, as we're going to see, is a takana based on a principle of Rabbi Chanina. Dam Rabbi Chanina, the Bar Torah, Midoraita, Chadine Mamunot, Bechadine Nefashot, Bidrisha, V'Chakira. That when it comes to capital or monetary cases, there should be cross-analysis with the witnesses, asking questions in order to determine if they're accurate or not. Turning to Gimel Amud Aleph, Shne'emar, as the pasuk says, Mishpat echad yeh lachem. One ruling should be for them for both monetary and capital cases. So really, you should need the same drisha v'chakira, the same level of severity by monetary, just like by capital cases. Umatam amru. So why did the Chachamim relax that? Using the principle of hefker beitin hefker, where they're allowed to relax things in monetary scenarios. Why did they say that? You don't need the cross-analysis on the witnesses for monetary cases. Let's say for loans, in order not to lock the door in front of borrowers. Because if they would require these cross-analysis, people would be uncomfortable to loan money. Because if they would loan money, they'd think maybe the witnesses who are witnessing the loan will make a mistake and they'll slip up, they'll contradict each other, and I won't be able to recoup my money. So therefore they said, we're going to relax it. We're not going to require drisha v'chakira when it comes to monetary loans. We're going to relax it. So similarly, says Rashi, it's the same thing here. Regarding loans in our scenario, if you really needed mumchin, so then people wouldn't be comfortable lending money. Maybe we won't find mumchin that are around when I want to recoup my loan. He'll deny it, and then I'll be stuck up a paddle without a creek. Up the creek without a paddle, sorry. So therefore, the Gemara says that Rabbi Chanina, based on this, Rabbi Yavo says that even though Iruv Parshiyot Katuv Kan, nonetheless, we're not going to require mumchin, even though they do require three. And Lamayata says, the Gemara, if that's true, what you're saying now is that when it comes to three-person courts, the hadyotot, the ordinary judges, are actually empowered by the chachamim to adjudicate them. So ta'olo yishalmu, as we're going to learn later, if the ordinary people make a mistake in adjudicating a court case, they have to pay back. But based on what we're saying now, they should be empowered like mumchin. They shouldn't have to pay back. So the Gemara answers, no. Kol shekin, if they didn't have to pay back, certainly at the Noel Del Bifnei Lovin, you'd lock the door in front of borrowers because people would be nervous. I'm going to get a non-professional court. I'm going to get a hedyotot type court, not a mumchin court. They're going to make a mistake. I'm not going to get my money back. So this was just necessary in order to keep things real, that people would continue to lend money. Yachi. Now the Gemara moves on now to the next section. Based on this shita of Rabbi Yavau, Tarti katani. So then, why didn't the Mishnah read the way you're understanding it as two different clauses? Not as the second clause explaining the first, but as two different points. Like this. When it comes to monetary laws, parentheses, loans, you need 3 hedyotot. That's clause number 1. And when it comes to the next category, gzelot and chavalot, you should have 3 professionals. So now this way, it's the same halacha ultimately, it just fits better in the language of the Mishnah. And furthermore, shlosha lamali, it breaks it up by saying 3 2 times. Why does it say that? It really sounds clear. There's 2 different clauses, not that the second explains the first. Ela Amar Rava, rather Rava says a second pshat, which is exactly that. Tarti katani mishum de Rabbi Chanina. Using this leniency that Rabbi Chanina applied to loans in monetary cases, you could interpret the Mishnah as 2 separate clauses. First, the Mishnah says when it comes to loans, you need 3 people, but they don't have to be mumchin. Again, because we're using this leniency so people will continue to lend money. And the second clause is saying that in gzelot and chavalot, we don't apply that leniency. Erev parshia katuv kan. What's going to happen is you need 3 professional judges, and therefore it's 2 separate clauses. And that's the second explanation that is accepted in the Gemara. Now, Rav Acha bar Rav Ika says a third pshat in the Mishnah. Rav Acha bar Rav Ika says, I agree with you, Rava, that there's 2 separate clauses, but he says as follows. Really, we don't say Erev Parshiyot Katuv Kan, which means that when it comes to loans, really it would be sufficient to have 1 judge and he would not have to be professional, because we don't apply Elohim to loans. Rav Acha bar Rav Ika Amar Midoraita Chad Nami Kasher. Midoraita, you need 1 for loans. Shne'amar, like the pasuk says, "B'tzedek tishpot amitecha." With righteousness you shall judge. Tishpot is singular. Judge your nation. When it comes to loans, really, and monetary cases, you only need 1. El mishum yoshvei kranot, but because of yoshvei kranot, which is business people that are not proficient in the laws of loans, for example. So the problem is, if you would only need 1, so then maybe somebody that would not be qualified to adjudicate would. So therefore, the rabbi said, put 3, and you'll be covered. Asks the Gemara, but even if you need 3, like you're saying now, it's still going to be a problem because they could all be these unqualified business people. So the Gemara answers, logically, you'll have 1 person amongst those 3 who had learned the halachot from his Rebbe, and he'll know how to adjudicate properly. Elameat asks the Gemara, similar to above, based on this Ta'olo Yeshalmu, what you're saying now is on a Torah level, you only need 1. So certainly then, and you don't need professional judges either. So why should they have to pay back? They should be covered. The Torah backs them up. Why should these judges who are not professional have to pay if they make a mistake? So the Gemara answers, Kol shekein denefish yoshvei kranot. If they weren't nervous that if they make a mistake, they won't have to pay back, so then they'll all be willing to adjudicate. So it's a way of preventing unqualified judges from getting involved in judging, and that would solve this issue. So ultimately, Rabbi Acha bar Rav Ika is saying, it breaks it up into 2 categories, because the first category altogether rabbinically only requires 3 judges of loans, and the second category, meaning the case of Gzelot and Chavalot, Midoraita actually requires 3, and Elohim, it also requires professional judges. Asks the Gemara, what is the distinction between Rava and Rav Acha bar Rav Ika? What's the practical halachic difference? The difference is the Amar Shmuel, the principle of Shmuel. Shnayim shedanu, when it comes to loans, if 2 people adjudicate a scenario of loans, dinei and din, it is considered effective. Ela shenekru beit din chatzuf, but it's considered a disrespectful, a chatzuf, a chutzpah type of beit din. So the Rava let the Shmuel. Rava can't agree with Shmuel because Rava says midoraita, you need 3. So 2 certainly would not be effective. Rav Acha bar Rav Ika itlei de Shmuel. Rav Acha bar Rav Ika does hold of Shmuel because he holds 1 midoraita would be sufficient. 3 is only midrabanan, and therefore 2 would be yotzei b'diavad if they adjudicated a case of loans. Now, moving on now to the 4th section of the day, the 5th section of the day. Excuse me. The Mishnah had told us nezek v'chatzi nezek v'chulei. Mishnah had said that nezek and chatzi nezek one second. Yeah. Nezek v'chatzi nezek v'chulei. So we said the second part of the Mishnah was that when it comes to full payments or half payments, again, you need a court of 3. The Gemara asks, in this 5th section, is that l'chorah, it would appear that this is unnecessary information, because we already said gzelot and chavalot, which is theft and bodily damages requires a court of 3. So nezek and chatzi nezek, which l'chaora has to do with bodily damage in this case. So why is that necessary to repeat? Asks the Gemara, nezek anu chavalot, nezek should be included under chavalot. So the Gemara answers, mishum dekabai lemitna chatzi nezek. Oh, since it wanted to teach half payments of damages, so it also taught full damage payments. Taninami nezek shalem. Asks the Gemara, chatzi nezek nami anu chavalot, but chatzi nezek is also included under chavalot. So the Gemara answers, Tana mamona v'katani knasa. As we explained, there's a distinction between compensation or compensatory payments, monetary payments, and penalties. So it taught chavalot, which is monetary payments, and then it taught chatzi nezek, which according to one Tana, one Amora, is considered a penalty, because really you shouldn't have to watch your animal if it's a tam, if it's a tame animal. The fact that it damages, the Torah requires half, but it's really a penalty. It only works if you hold chatzi nezek is a penalty. But if you hold that half nezek, chatzi nezek is monetary payment, so you don't need to repeat this. The Gemara answers, since it needed to teach the double payment, as well as the 4 and 5 times, turning to Gimel Bet, those are types of payments that are more than the damage that's caused. Because a thief pays double if he steals and he's caught, and someone who steals a sheep or an ox pays 4 or 5 times. So it's 4 or 5 times the principal, or double the principal. So it wanted to teach these cases that you don't pay the principal, but you pay more. Once it wanted to teach those cases, so it also taught chatzi nezek, which is a scenario you don't pay the principal, you pay less than the principal. And once it taught chatzi nezek, which is less than the principal, it also taught nezek, because those cases always go together. Moving on to the 6th section now, the Gemara tells us, Shlosha min nalan. How do we know that this court of 3 of monetary cases is a court of 3? We showed in the Mishnah how we know 71, how we know 23, but the Gemara now says, where do we find the source for that a court for monetary cases is 3? Says the Gemara, the Tanu Rabbanan, as the Braita teaches, V'nikra balabayit el Elohim. Again in the parasha of Shomrim, it says, the balabayit, the owner of the item, will bring the shomer to the Elohim, to the judges. Harei kanacha, that's one time. Ad Elohim yavod varshneihem, and this is the next pasuk, pasuk chet. It says, until the judges, they shall both come, the matter of both of them. It's Tarei Kan Shnaim, that's 2. Asher Yashir Elohim, and then the 3rd time it says that the judges shall incriminate. Harei Kan Shlosha, Div Reb Yoshia. Reb Yoshia says, from here you see 3 judges are necessary for monetary cases. Reb Yonatan Omer, Rishon Tchila Ne'emar Vein Darshin Tchilot. You can't expound the first one because that's the introductory Elohim, which is necessary to teach us that you need professional judges that are smuchin. Ela Ad Elohim Yavod Varshnei. So therefore the second one, it says, Ad Elohim Yavod Varshnei Marei Kanacha, that refers to 1 judge. Asher Yashun Elohim, the second time, Marei Kan Shnayim, that refers to 2 judges. The Ein Beitin Shakulna, you can't have an even court. So Mosifin Alein Odechad, you have to add 1 more, Marei Kan Shlosha, so you have a total of 3. So they both hold you need 3, it's just a matter of how you conclude that. It says the Gemara, Neima, let us suggest that it seems to be a machloket if you can expound the initial appearance of the word, and this is a general shas machloket, as would be applied here as well. According to Rabbi Yoshia, even though it's used for something else, teaching us that it's professional judges, you can also expound that first time in Ikra Balabayit El Elohim for the number 3. Rabbi Yonatan says you can't. So the Gemara says, lo, everybody agrees, you can't expound the first place that it appears. Rabbi Yoshua will say, there's a reason that I hold over here, you could still expound it, even though it's necessary to teach us something else. Why? Because if it was only to teach us professional judges, it could have used the word shofet. Shofet means professional judges. Elohim. Why does it say Elohim? So obviously it's there for something else, which is to teach us the number of 3 professional judges. But Elohim is a language of greatness, of gdula, that you need the gdula. That's also true, but also it's there to teach us this idea of 3. Rabbi Yonatan says no, that's just the appropriate language to use. Elohim is the appropriate terminology, as is evidenced, as we're about to see. People call judges a certain way. So in the context of the verses, talking about a professional smuchin, he used the word Elohim, and therefore that's what it's to teach us, not for the number. Like people say, somebody that has a court case should go to the judges. So there's nothing else to be deduced in terms of the number, and therefore you have to add on 1 more based on the fact that you can't have an even court. Asks the Gemara, it would emerge that Rabbi Yoshia does not hold seemingly you have to have an odd number court. It seems that the only way he knows that it's an odd number here of 3 is because it says the word 3 times. But he does not use the svara of Rabbi Yonatan, and therefore the Gemara asks, Rabbi Yoshia, letle beitin noteh, does Rabbi Yoshia not hold it has to be an imbalanced and odd number? V'hatanya, but the Braita says, Rabbi Eliezer ben Rabbi Yosef Glili Omer, ma Talmud lomar lintot acharei Rabbi latot. Why does it repeat this word in lintot and then latot again at the end of the verse that it has to be you follow the majority, which means there has to be an odd number? HaTorah amra selecha beitin noteh. The Torah is teaching us you have to have an odd number. So says the Gemara, l'chaora, that seems to be a very logical drasha. Why would Rabbi Yoshia disagree? So the Gemara answers, Savar like Rabbi Yehuda. No, he does disagree. He holds like Rabbi Yehuda, Amar Shivim. In our Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda said the great Sanhedrin could be 70, which is an even number. The Tanakh, like the Mishnah says, Sanhedrin Gdolai Tashal Shivim Ve'echad. The Tanakama of our Mishnah said it has to be 71. Rabbi Yehuda, Omer Shivim, Rabbi Yehuda said it has to be 70. So the Gemara says, just like Rabbi Yehuda says 70, Rabbi Yoshia applies that also for monetary cases. It could be more than 3, it could be 4. Eimar challenges the Gemara. Eimar deshamat le Rabbi Yehuda b'Sanhedrin Gdola. Rabbi Yehuda only held that by the Sanhedrin Gdola tichtivi krai, because there's a pasuk that says esfali shivim skenim. It says gather 70. So there's a specific pasuk that says it could be 70, an even number. But b'sha'ar beidina mi shamat le, does Rabbi Yehuda hold by other courts, including monetary courts, they could be an even number? The chitem aloshna, maybe you'll say he does. He holds that even courts, that monetary courts could be an even number as well. V'atana, and the problem is that the Mishnah is going to tell us, or our Mishnah told us in Bet Amud Aleph, Smichat Skinim V'Arifat Tegla B'Shlosha de Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon said that when it comes to leaning on the animal that the Sanhedrin needs to bring, because they paskin wrong and the Jews followed, most of the Jews followed in sin. So Rabbi Shimon said you need 3 of the Sanhedrin to partake in that process. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'chamisha. Rabbi Yehuda said you need 5. V'amina my time at Rabbi Yehuda. And the Gemara is going to say later on, Yud Bet, what is the reasoning of Rabbi Yehuda? You need 5 for leaning on that animal, because the pasuk says as follows: V'samchu es shnayim. Samchu is they shall lean is plural, so that means 2. Ziknei and ziknei, the elders, plural. Shnayim, that means 2 as well. Ve'en beitin shakul, and beitin is not going to be an even number, so mosifin alein od echad, you have to add another one. Now this is talking about a smaller court. This isn't talking about the court of 71. So you see what? That although Rabbi Yehuda reikan chamisha, so what do you see? Although Rabbi Yehuda holds regarding the court of 70, it could be an even number. By the lower courts, he doesn't hold that. It can't be an even number, and thus the smaller courts need to be able to be tipped. So if Rabbi Yoshia holds like Rabbi Yehuda, he doesn't have a raya, because when it comes to a 3-person court, it shouldn't be allowed to be an even number. So the Gemara answers, indeed, that's what he holds. To Rabbi Yoshia, adifa mid Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yoshia actually extends the rule beyond what Rabbi Yehuda does. To either Rabbi Yehuda b'Sanhedrin Gdola or deletle. Rabbi Yehuda only says in the Great Sanhedrin it doesn't have to be an odd number; it could be 70. Ha b'shar beidina itle. But regarding other courts, Rabbi Yehuda says it has to be an odd number, like the pasuk implies. Rabbi Yoshia b'shar beidina nami letle. Rabbi Yoshia says even regarding other courts, like a 3-person court, it could be 4. That would not be an issue. Asks the Gemara the obvious question, but what does he do with the verse that we brought above that teaches us it has to be an odd number? So the Gemara answers, he says that's talking about capital cases, 23-person courts. Those have to be an odd number. But by a 3-person beitin, the small courts for monetary cases, that could be actually 4 or 6, it could be an even number. Asks the Gemara, but the Mishnah later on Chavtet Amud Aleph, it's going to say, Shnayim omrim zakai. In a monetary case, if 2 people say innocent, ve'echad omer chayav, and 1 person says guilty, zakai, the person is innocent. Shnayim omrim chayav, if 1 person says guilty, ve'echad omer zakai, and 1 says innocent, chayav is guilty. Now, if Rabbi Yoshia holds that you don't have to have an odd number when it comes to 3-person courts, so logically then if you have 3 people adjudicating, the Gemara assumes it would need to be that all 3 would paskin in the direction for you to follow. And yet the Mishnah says clearly 2 will override the 1. So name a deloka Rabbi Yoshia. Perhaps that Mishnah would come out not like the position of Rabbi Yoshia. Gemara answers, Afil Tame Rabbi Yoshia could be like Rabbi Yoshia. Because even though he holds that the monetary courts could be an even number, but if it's an odd number, he would derive that a majority would win based on a kal v'chomer from capital cases. By capital courts, the chamiri, which are much more strict, the person could be chayav mita. Marachmanan, yet the Torah says, zil bataruba, you have to follow the majority. So certainly when it comes to monetary cases, you'll also follow the majority, and you wouldn't need them all to pass in one direction in order to follow that. Moving on to the last section, I believe the 7th section of the day. The Gemara now shows us actually there's a machloket about this issue if 3 is sufficient when it comes to monetary cases. Tanu Abanan says the Braita. Tinema, when it comes to monetary cases, you only need 3. Tanakam's opinion. Rebbe Omer, Rebbe says, B'chamisha, you need 5. In order that you conclude the court case with 3. Means 3 people will be paskening in one direction. That's what's necessary. So the Gemara says, what do you mean? Etu bitlata milo gamar dina betray. If you need a majority, well, when you have 3, 2 will also conclude the court case. So what's the difference? So the Gemara says, this is what Rabbi Yehuda means to say. No, you need to have a gemar din. There has to be a conclusive psak in one direction with 3 people following that. So therefore you need 5 so that the majority could be 3. Alma, the Gemara says it would appear then, Kasavar, that Rebbe is of the opinion, that when the Torah writes Elohim 3 times, B'gemar dina, or 2 times, and then the last is added in because it can't be even. Kiktivi, B'gemar dina ktivi, it's talking about in conclusion. Meaning when the Torah writes Elohim 3 times, it's to be interpreted, you need 3 judges at the end in order, meaning going in that direction, the paskin that way. And that's why you need 5 actually, to start off. But the Gemara says, Megadif bar Rabbi Yavo, he couldn't understand this, he castigated this, or he was surprised by this. Based on that logic, the great Sanhedrin should need 141, because you should need 71 as the majority, the way you're learning it. The pasuk says 71, as we're understanding. So you should really need 141. So that the conclusive psak should be with 71 in that direction. And then furthermore, the smaller capital courts require 45. So that the conclusive direction would be 23 people paskening in that direction. Ella, obviously the Gemara says that's not true, because Esfali, Shiv'im ish, it says in the Torah, gather 70 people, meaning when you gather them, there has to be 70, but you don't need 70 paskening in that other direction. And similarly, it says in terms of the drasha we brought in the Mishnah, which was 23, it means when you start adjudicating the case, there has to be 23. Hachinami, so the Gemara says also you can't explain Rebbe that way, because when we brought the psukim earlier that show us by monetary cases you need 3, so obviously what is it talking? It means when they begin, when they approach, in order to judge, you need 3, but not that you need 3 in the end in order to paskin in that direction. So Ella, the Gemara says it must be Rebbe is to be explained differently. The reasoning of Rebbe is as follows. The next, you don't darshan the first pasuk, says Rashi, because ein darshin chilot. As we brought up before, we actually go like Rabbi Yonatan, and even Rabbi Yoshi agrees ein darshin chilot. He just has a chiddush why we could expound this, but we don't expound the first one. So we have the second and the third. Now regarding those, does the word Elohim mean plural, 2 judges, or does it mean singular, 1 judge? Now, what would sway the decision? Because the pasuk says, actually it's read, Asher Yarshi'un Elohim. This is the 3rd time it appears. That the judges shall incriminate. Now Yarshi'un is plural. Trey. So Elohim there, Mistama, is also plural, because the noun is connected to the verb is plural, the noun is also to be interpreted as plural. Continues Rebbe, Ne'amar Elohim lamata, and therefore, since it says Elohim in the 2nd pasuk, 3rd time it says it below, the Ne'amar Elohim lamala, and it says the word Elohim in that same verse above, just as at the end of the verse, pasuk chet, we're saying it's plural, because Yarshi'un is plural, so the earlier time in the verse, it's also plural. But that would mean 4. Ve'en beitin shakul, you can't have an even court, so mosifin aleyen or echad. We'd have to add on 1 more judge, harekan chamisha, that would be a total of 5. Turning to Dalet with Aleph, for Rabbanan, but the Rabbanan say back, you can't bring a proof from Yarshi'un, because actually it's written in the Torah without a vav between the resh and the nun. Excuse me, the Yarshi'un, between the ayin and the nun. So therefore, it's read Yarshi'an. It could be read Yarshi'an. That's traditionally what we have in the Torah. That's the writing. So therefore, Rabbanan Yarshi'an ktiv, he shall incriminate, which is singular. And therefore, the word Elohim is singular. The one before is also singular. You can't have an even court, so it would be a total of 3, because you'd have to add 1 more. So just to conclude, Rabbanan Yarshi'an ktiv, this will tie us, God willing, into tomorrow's Amud and Dalid, which is a general machloket if we say Yesh Em LeMesoret or Yesh Em LeMikra. As the Rabbanan say, we follow the written, the way it's written, As we see in the Torah, it's written Yarshi'an, so therefore it's singular. And Rebbe holds Ish Em Lemikra, which means we follow the way it's traditionally been read, which is Yarshi'un. That's the way we'll expound it, and therefore it's actually plural. Thus you have 4 plus 1 is 5. As we've concluded now, that's how we're clarifying the two positions of the Rabbanan and Rebbe, 3 or 5 when it comes to monetary courts. We'll stop here, top of Daled Amud Aleph. So Hashem will pick up tomorrow with Daled Amud Aleph. Shabbat Tov again. And I forgot to mention before, but our learning tonight was Refuah Shleima for Yaakov ben Dinah. We should hear B'sorat Tovot, Refuah Shleima, and all the best. A wonderful week, everybody.